In August 2017, 31-year-old Miles Kessler and his wife, 32-year-old Tessa Kessler, stepped out of their daily routines and into the kind of silence you can only find deep in the mountains, where your phone becomes dead weight, the air tastes like pine resin, and time starts to measure itself in miles instead of minutes. If you're enjoying this video, subscribe to the Forgotten Vanishings channel and hit the like button to support more deep dives like this. They had driven up from Flagstaff, Arizona, a town that breeds hikers the way coastal cities breed surfers. Flagstaff people learn early that weekends aren't meant to be spent indoors. They're meant to be spent above the tree line, under wide skies, with your legs aching in a way that feels honest. Miles and Tessa fit that culture perfectly. Friends described them as capable but careful two people who knew the difference between confidence and complacency. They planned a 4-day backpacking trip into the remote backcountry of Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. The route wasn't casual. It was the kind of trip you plan with a pencil, a map, and a respect for how quickly the backcountry can punish assumptions. They intended to traverse the Death Canyon Trail, camp at multiple designated sites, and return to the trailhead by August 18, 2017. Miles worked as a software engineer for a San Francisco-based tech company, mostly remote, and he had a reputation for treating logistics the way he treated code anticipate failure, build redundancy, don't rely on luck. Tessa was a freelance graphic designer, and she had recently finished a big contract that left her drained and restless. The trip, she told her sister, was a reset 4 days of walking, talking, and sleeping under a fabric roof, while the mountains did what mountains do: make your problems feel both smaller and sharper. 2 weeks before they left, the couple filed their permit application with the Park Service. They listed a plan to hike roughly 35 miles over 4 days and carry all necessary supplies: a tent, sleeping bags, a water filtration system, a small stove, a first aid kit, and enough freeze-dried meals to cover the trip with a modest buffer. They'd done multi-day treks in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Montana. Their gear wasn't trendy. It was functional. Their habits weren't reckless. They were routine. On the morning of August 15, 2017, they checked in at the Moose Visitor Center. A ranger reviewed their itinerary, confirmed their designated campsites, and issued their backcountry permit. Later, in the official case file, the ranger's notes would describe them as prepared, aware of terrain and standard protocols, in good spirits. One detail stood out in those notes. Miles and Tessa had a 2-way radio with them. It wasn't required, but rangers strongly recommended some form of reliable communication for anyone pushing into isolated sections of the park. That radio, the ranger wrote, was a sign they were thinking ahead. Their vehicle, a silver Honda CR-V, was left in the Death Canyon trailhead parking area. A trail camera nearby captured them at roughly 9:30 a.m., packs on, hats low, moving with the loose confidence of people who've carried weight up slopes often enough to know their pace. Other hikers last recalled seeing them around 2:00 p.m., about 5 miles in, moving steadily toward the upper canyon. The weather was cooperative, clear and warm, temperatures in the low 70s, no storm warnings, no obvious environmental threats that would have spooked experienced backpackers. It was the kind of day that makes you think the world is gentle. It wasn't. When August 18th passed without Miles and Tessa returning to the trailhead, no immediate alarm was raised. In the backcountry, schedule is a flexible word. People add a day. People linger at a lake because the light is perfect. People take a side route because a ranger mentioned a view that wasn't on the brochure. Most delays are harmless. But by the evening of August 19th, concern had hardened into something heavier. Their car was still in the same parking spot. Neither had contacted anyone. No message to family, no check-in, no casual, "we're off the trail" text that hikers send out of habit the moment service returns. Tessa's older sister, Renee Hartman, lived in Jackson, Wyoming. She had been expecting a call from Tessa as soon as they got back. When she didn't hear anything by midday on the 19th, she tried to keep her mind from spiraling. She told herself they were fine, just delayed. Then she did what worried family members always do. She went to look. Renee drove to the trailhead that afternoon. The silver CRV sat there as if it had been parked an hour ago. Dust on the tires. No movement. No note. No sign of return. She called the park rangers and filed a missing persons report. The official search began early the next morning, August 20th, 2017. A team of 12 rangers, supported by Teton County search and rescue volunteers, moved onto the Death Canyon Trail with the standard approach. Start with the most likely, the most logical. They checked the marked campsites on the couple's permit route. They looked for disturbed ground, broken twigs, food packaging, ash from a stove, a tent footprint, anything. They found nothing. No tent, no gear, no fresh fire scar, no leftovers of human activity at any of the campsites Miles and Tessa were expected to use. The absence was striking. Even careful hikers leave something behind. A boot print in soft soil, a snapped branch, a crushed patch of grass where a pack was dropped. Searchers are trained to read the woods like that, and the woods, in this case, read as blank. On the second day, a helicopter was deployed. From the air, search teams scanned canyon walls, ridge lines, and the valley floor for bright fabric, reflective metal, smoke, movement, anything unnatural against granite and green. Death. Canyon is rugged and complex, with steep cliffs, dense pine forests, boulder fields, and pockets of terrain that can swallow visibility even from above. The helicopter made multiple passes. No sightings. Ground teams expanded their search radius beyond the permit route. They moved into side trails and unofficial paths. Hikers sometimes follow creek beds, drainage lines, animal corridors that look like trails until they don't. They checked places where an injured person might crawl for shelter. They checked drop-offs where a fall could occur without leaving obvious traces. On day 3, search dogs were brought in. Handlers used items from the couple's home to establish a scent profile and worked the dogs along the Death Canyon corridor. The dogs showed interest in a few spots, brief, intense sniffing, circling, a short pull forward, then nothing sustained. No clear track, no consistent direction. In the case file, the handlers described it as unusual and inconclusive. By the end of the first week, more than 50 people had participated in the search, covering over 100 square miles of backcountry. Not a single piece of physical evidence had been recovered. No backpack, no water bottle, no torn clothing, no identifiable footprints that could be confidently attributed to the couple. No human remains. It wasn't only frightening, it was baffling. As the days passed, the search evolved from methodical to creative, then to desperate. Teams replayed their assumptions. Did the couple actually follow the route they listed? Did they take a spur trail? Did they chase a view? Did they attempt an unmarked overlook and end up off route? Did they cross terrain they had no business crossing? Park officials answered questions with cautious language, as they always do. They emphasized the size of the park, the complexity of terrain, the reality that even experienced hikers can get disoriented. They reminded the public that being experienced doesn't make you immune. Local news stations covered the story. Hiking forums filled with speculation. People pulled trail maps and tried to solve it from their couches. Every suggestion had a confident tone. They must have fallen here. They probably got turned around there. Maybe the dogs missed the scent because wind patterns do this. None of it changed the empty reality on the ground. By early September, active searching was scaled back. The case remained open, but the intensity faded into routine patrol awareness. Rangers were instructed to stay alert for gear, clothing, or any trace during backcountry work. Renee was updated with careful, sympathetic statements that offered no real comfort. Miles's parents, back in Arizona, cycled between hope and dread. Tessa's friends organized online campaigns. Flyers went up in Jackson and in nearby towns. A reward was offered for credible information. Then weeks turned into months. Autumn came, snow arrived, and the mountains kept their secret. For almost 2 years, nothing changed. The silver Honda was eventually towed from the trailhead and returned to Renee, who kept it in her garage like a relic she couldn't bury. She couldn't sell it. Selling it felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. The file moved to the inactive section of the sheriff's database, one case among many, each with its own version of silence. Then, in late July 2019, a solo backpacker named Logan Pierce was hiking in a remote area of the park, several miles northwest of the Death Canyon corridor. Logan was an experienced wilderness traveler who preferred solitude to crowds. He chose routes that didn't show up in glossy guidebooks, places where you don't pass 10 people in an hour, where the only tracks are elk and the wind. He had been exploring narrow ravines and rocky outcrops when he noticed something that didn't belong, a faint, distinct smell of smoke. Not wildfire smoke, not the sharp chemical bite of something burning out of control. This was wood smoke, small, controlled, domestic, in a place that should have been empty. Curiosity in the backcountry can be dangerous, but so can ignoring signs that someone might be in trouble. Logan followed the smell uphill, picking his way through loose scree and boulders. After 20 minutes, he reached a steep rock face, nearly 40 feet tall, rising out of the terrain like a wall. At first, he saw nothing. Then he noticed a dark opening, partially obscured by juniper branches and weathered driftwood stacked in a way that didn't look natural. A cave. From inside, he heard faint sounds. Not the echo of water. Not wind. Something softer. Murmurs. Irregular and indistinct, like voices that couldn't quite become speech. Logan called out. He identified himself as a hiker. He asked if anyone needed help. What answered him wasn't a call for assistance. It was a sudden rustle, followed by a high-pitched shriek. Thin, sharp, almost animal-like, then silence, so complete it made the hairs on his arms lift. He stood still, uncertain whether to retreat or approach. He called out again, more carefully, explaining he didn't mean harm and was only checking on them. After a long pause, a voice came from the darkness, hoarse, broken, words barely holding together. "Go away," it said, or something close. "They'll see you. They'll know." The sentence landed wrong. It didn't sound like a normal backcountry encounter. It didn't sound like an injured person asking for help. But he could not ignore the possibility that someone inside was injured, disoriented, or in a mental state that made communication hard. Logan approached slowly, took out a flashlight, and shone it into the opening. 2 figures were crouched near the back wall, huddled together against stone. They were filthy. Their clothes were torn and stained with dirt, ash, and what looked like old, dried blood. Their hair was long, matted, tangled with debris. The man had a thick beard hanging down to his chest. The woman's hair formed a chaotic halo around her face, so snarled it didn't look combable anymore, like it had grown into a single woven mass. Both were barefoot. Their feet were blackened and calloused, the kind of feet you see on someone who hasn't worn shoes in a very long time. Their eyes reflected the flashlight like nocturnal animals, wide, unblinking, unaccustomed to light. Logan spoke softly, hands visible, posture low. He asked if they were hurt, if they needed water, if he could call for help. The woman began rocking, muttering under her breath in a repetitive rhythm. The man raised a hand to shield his face, then suddenly lunged forward, not in an attack, but in a jerky, uncoordinated movement, like a marionette with tangled strings. He shouted something unintelligible, a string of syllables that didn't form words. Logan stepped back, heart hammering. He realized immediately that these were not lost hikers in any ordinary sense. Something fundamental had happened to them. Something beyond hunger and bruises. He tried again, carefully. "Are you Miles Kessler? Are you Tessa Kessler?" At the names, the woman stopped rocking. Her head tilted, and for a second her expression shifted, blank terror giving way to something that looked like recognition. Then she shook her head violently, as if trying to shake the thought loose, and began muttering again. The man retreated deeper into the cave, pulling her with him. Logan did not follow. He backed away until he felt safer, then activated the emergency beacon on his satellite communication device. Within minutes, he was connected to a dispatcher at the Teton County Sheriff's Office. He described the situation as clearly as he could. 2 people, male and female, living in a cave, appearing severely malnourished and mentally unstable, possibly matching a missing persons case from 2017. The dispatcher instructed him to remain in the area, but not to re-enter the cave or attempt further contact. A rescue team was mobilized immediately. By early evening, a helicopter carrying 4 park rangers and 2 paramedics was airborne, heading toward the coordinates Logan provided. The terrain was too rough to land close, so the team was dropped into a clearing about half a mile away and hiked in on foot with medical supplies, blankets, food, and extraction equipment. When they arrived near dusk, Logan was waiting. He briefed them quickly. The smoke smell, the cave entrance, the voices, the shriek, the condition of the people inside. The lead ranger, Marisol Green, had spent nearly 2 decades in wilderness rescue. She approached the cave cautiously and announced her presence in a calm, steady tone. She explained they were there to help, that no one was in trouble, and that they only wanted to make sure everyone was safe. No response. Marisol waited and repeated her message. Then, from the darkness, the man's voice came again, slightly clearer. "We can't leave," he said. "They're watching. They won't let us go." Marisol asked who was watching. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he began talking rapidly in a low, urgent stream. Shapes in the trees, eyes in the rocks, voices that came at night, warnings that told them to stay hidden. His speech jumped between thoughts without clear connections. The woman began humming, a tuneless droning sound that filled the cave and spilled into the evening air. One of the paramedics, Derek Vaughn, kept his voice low as he spoke to Marisol. "Severe trauma," he suggested. "Malnutrition, dehydration, prolonged isolation, possibly psychosis." The priority was to avoid triggering panic. Marisol agreed. She instructed a ranger to prepare water and high-calorie food. They placed the supplies just inside the cave entrance, close enough to be reached, but not so close it felt invasive. Then they stepped back. Marisol told them the food and water were there whenever they were ready, and no one would force them to do anything. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the man crawled forward. His movements were hesitant, jerky, as if his body didn't fully obey. He grabbed a water bottle and retreated. The sound of desperate drinking echoed from inside. Gulps, then coughing. The woman did not move. Night was dropping fast. The temperature began to fall. Marisol knew they couldn't leave 2 severely compromised people in a cave overnight without medical evaluation. But she also knew that forcing them out could cause injury, terror, or violence born from panic. She tried a different approach. "What's your name?" she asked gently. A long pause, then barely a whisper. "Miles." The confirmation rippled through the team. If the man was Miles Kessler, the woman beside him was almost certainly Tessa. Marisol radioed the information back to base. Within minutes, the sheriff's department began the chain of notifications. Renee Hartman received a call that knocked the air out of her lungs. They had been found alive. At the cave, the team continued slowly. They offered more water and food. Over time, both accepted small bites, small sips. Marisol kept her tone calm and consistent. No sudden movements, no crowding, no pressure for explanations. Eventually, Miles spoke again. "If we leave," he said, "they'll find us." Marisol asked who he was afraid of. "The ones who live here," Miles whispered. "The ones who watch." The words chilled everyone present, not because they suggested something supernatural, but because they revealed a mind that had built a prison out of fear. A mind that believed rescue itself was a threat. Marisol made the decision to proceed with a gentle but firm extraction. She explained they needed to come with the team, that they would be taken somewhere warm and safe, that doctors would help them. Miles resisted at first, retreating deeper into the cave. Then Tessa stood. Her legs shook violently. She braced herself against the wall, unsteady, breathing hard like standing alone was an effort. But she took one step toward the entrance. Miles watched her, expression torn between fear and confusion. Then, slowly, he followed. The team moved around them without crowding, hands ready to steady them, but not grabbing. They wrapped both in thermal blankets. Tessa flinched at the open sky beyond the cave mouth, as if it were something dangerous, too wide, too exposed. Miles kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes darting to shadows between trees. The walk to the helicopter took nearly an hour. Their bodies were exhausted, muscles weak from long starvation, joints stiff, feet injured and tender from years of barefoot movement. They stumbled repeatedly. Derek checked them as they walked, speaking softly, offering water in small amounts. When they reached the clearing, the helicopter's presence seemed to overwhelm them. The noise, the spinning rotors, the bright lights, too much stimulation. Tessa began shaking harder. Miles tried to pull back. Marisol held her voice steady. She told them they were safe. She told them they were going to the hospital. She told them no one was going to hurt them. They were loaded into the helicopter carefully, strapped in, and given additional water. Derek attached monitoring equipment, checked pulse, blood pressure, respiration. Both were severely dehydrated, malnourished, suffering from exposure-related injuries, including infected cuts on feet and hands. Their heart rates were elevated, pupils dilated, markers of extreme stress and possible neurological disturbance. During the flight, neither spoke. They sat rigid, staring ahead, flinching at vibrations and voices. When Derek tried to examine Tessa's hands more closely, she jerked away and began trembling harder, eyes wide with fear. He didn't push. The helicopter landed at St. John's Medical Center in Jackson shortly after 10 p.m. A medical team was waiting in the trauma bay, ER physicians and psychiatric specialists already briefed on the situation. Miles and Tessa were brought into separate examination rooms, placed adjacent, so neither felt completely isolated. The attending physician overseeing Tessa's initial evaluation, Dr. Priya Menon, later described her condition as one of the most severe combinations of physical neglect and psychological distress she had seen in years. Tessa's weight was dangerously low, roughly 30% below expected for her frame. Her skin was marked with sores, insect bites, and scratches, some appearing self-inflicted. Her hair had to be cut away in sections to allow basic hygiene and medical assessment. Her nails were broken and packed with dirt and organic debris. Blood work revealed profound vitamin deficiencies and markers consistent with chronic starvation. Miles's condition was similarly grave. Dr. Roland Bishop, who examined him, noted extensive muscle wasting, signs of frostbite damage on several toes, and healed fractures in his left hand that had never been properly set. His beard and hair showed infestation and poor hygiene, consistent with long-term wilderness exposure. His teeth showed decay and damage, consistent with a prolonged diet lacking basic nutrients. He was dangerously underweight and severely dehydrated. Both were admitted to intensive care under continuous observation. Over the first 72 hours, their bodies stabilized slowly. IV fluids, antibiotics, careful nutrition introduced in measured amounts to avoid refeeding syndrome, wound care, monitoring for organ stress. Their vitals improved in increments, but psychologically, the situation remained volatile. Tessa didn't speak at all during the first 2 days. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling or the wall, occasionally rocking, occasionally whimpering. When nurses approached, she recoiled and sometimes cried out sound without language. A clinical psychologist, Dr. Kendra Vale, assessed her and documented symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress, possible psychosis, and episodes that resembled catatonia. Dr. Vale recommended transfer to psychiatric care as soon as Tessa's medical condition allowed. Miles spoke, but his words were fragmented and frequently incoherent. He answered questions with unrelated statements, veered into sudden tangents, or muttered as if arguing with someone invisible. When asked what happened during the missing period, he became agitated and insisted they were not missing, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, that leaving the cave was a mistake. He repeated the same themes: being watched, being followed, being warned by voices that came from rocks and trees. When pressed for details, he could not hold a coherent narrative long enough to provide one. On the 4th day, Tessa spoke her first words. A nurse entered with a meal tray and set it on the bedside table. Tessa stared at it for a long time, then looked directly at the nurse and said in a flat voice, "They told us not to eat the red ones?" The nurse asked what she meant. Tessa turned back toward the wall and did not answer. Later that evening, she spoke again in short, disjointed bursts. She talked about shadows that moved when no one looked, sounds at night that weren't animals, a presence deep inside the mountain that demanded silence. She said she and Miles tried to leave many times, but every time they walked away, they became disoriented and ended up back where they started. She described an overwhelming fear that grew stronger the farther they moved from the cave. Fear so intense it felt physical, like pressure on the chest. Dr. Vale noted that both Miles and Tessa showed signs consistent with a shared delusional system, a mutually reinforced breakdown that can occur in extreme isolation and dependence. Dr. Vale brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Owen Rourke, to conduct formal evaluations and assess competency for investigative interviews. Meanwhile, investigators from the Teton County Sheriff's Department began trying to reconstruct what actually happened. The lead detective assigned was Janelle Ortiz, an experienced investigator with a history in missing persons cases who had participated in coordination meetings during the original 2017 search. When she learned Miles and Tessa had been found alive, her first reaction was disbelief, quickly followed by the same questions everyone asked. How did they survive for nearly 2 years? Why weren't they found? What prevented them from walking out? Ortiz began with the most reliable witness, Logan Pierce. Logan gave a detailed account of the discovery: the smell of smoke, the hidden cave entrance, the voices, the shriek, the couple's physical condition, their fearful behavior. He described their eyes, how they reflected the flashlight like animals, how they seemed both terrified and detached, as if normal human interaction had become foreign. The smell of smoke mattered. It suggested they had maintained fire, which implied routine, planning, and at least some functional survival strategy, however fractured their minds had become. Ortiz coordinated with park rangers to secure the cave and perform a systematic examination. A documentation team arrived with instructions: photograph everything, log every object, collect samples, assess environmental factors, and determine whether anything at the site could explain prolonged survival and the couple's mental state. The cave was small, about 15 feet deep and roughly 8 feet wide at its widest point. The ceiling sloped low, forcing a crouch in most areas. The floor was layered with pine needles, dried grass, and animal fur evidence of crude bedding. In one corner, a fire pit built from stacked stones contained charred wood and ash. Nearby were several food wrappers. Remnants of freeze-dried meals matching brands and types listed on the couple's original gear inventory. But there weren't nearly enough wrappers to account for nearly 2 years. So what had they eaten? Investigators found scattered animal bones, small rodents, birds, and what appeared to be rabbit remains. They found evidence of foraged materials, berries, roots, edible plants, and fungi. Some species were safe, others were not. A ranger with botanical expertise identified traces consistent with Amanita muscaria, known for psychoactive effects that can include hallucinations, confusion, and cognitive impairment. The same expert noted signs of water hemlock, an extremely poisonous plant capable of causing seizures and delirium. Samples were collected and sent for analysis. The presence of toxic and psychoactive plants offered one possible explanation for the couple's watchers and voices. Chronic malnutrition alone can cause cognitive collapse and psychosis-like symptoms. Add repeated ingestion of hallucinogenic or poisonous substances, and the mind can become a hostile place, one that feels as real as the trees outside. The team also recovered items that raised new questions. A small notebook, warped and stained, was wedged between rocks near the cave entrance. The handwriting started neat and organized, then deteriorated into frantic, barely legible scrawl. Early pages resembled normal trail notes, observations about weather, mileage, wildlife. The entries began on August 15, 2017. The last clearly dated entry was August 17, 2017, written in Tessa's handwriting, later confirmed by comparison with samples from her family. It read, "Lost the main trail. Followed a deer path, thinking it would loop back. Now we are somewhere we do not recognize. The map does not match the terrain. Miles thinks we should head east toward higher ground. We'll try in the morning." After that, the notebook entries lost dates and coherence. Pages contained scattered phrases. No signal. Tried twice. Saw smoke but couldn't reach it. Miles says we're being followed. One page held a single sentence in large, shaky letters. Do not trust the voices. The final pages were chaotic. Words over words. Sentences broken. Phrases repeated with obsessive intensity. They come at night. The mountain is alive. We can't leave the circle. Red eyes in the stones. On the last page, someone had drawn a crude diagram, a rough circle with several marks inside and lines radiating outward, ending in X's. Investigators couldn't interpret it with certainty. It might have been an attempt to map the area, or a record of escape attempts that always ended in failure. The team also found the damaged two-way radio noted in the Ranger's original check-in. It was partially crushed. The battery compartment was corroded and empty. Whether it had been dropped, struck, or deliberately destroyed was unclear. But it explained why no call for help was received, even if they tried early on. Fragments of the couple's original gear were recovered as well. Torn tent fabric stuffed into a crevice, portions of a sleeping bag scattered on the cave floor, a trekking pole snapped in half near the fire pit. Some gear appeared repurposed, some deteriorated, some damaged in ways that suggested panic or struggle. One detail bothered search and rescue personnel the most. There was no evidence of deliberate signaling, no rock-arranged SOS, no bright fabric tied to trees along obvious corridors, no directional arrows made of stones, no cleared area meant to be visible from above. It was as if the couple either chose not to be found or their minds degraded to to the point that rescue stopped meaning what it used to mean. Detective Ortiz reviewed the physical evidence alongside medical reports and witness statements. She requested formal psychiatric competency evaluations to determine whether Miles and Tessa could provide reliable testimony about their missing period, and to reconstruct a timeline without mutual reinforcement of delusions. Dr. Vale and Dr. Rourke began a structured interview process with both patients separately, building slowly from basic orientation questions to detailed memory reconstruction. Tessa's sessions were slow. For days, she responded with single words or silence. Gradually, she began to speak in longer sentences. She recalled the beginning of the hike clearly, checking in at Moose, stepping onto the trail, excitement, the pleasure of steady movement, meeting other hikers. Then her memory became hazy around the second and third day. She described taking a wrong turn while trying to reach a scenic overlook, not clearly marked on their map. They followed what looked like a path, but it narrowed, became less defined, and eventually vanished. By the time they realized they were lost, the terrain felt unfamiliar, and late afternoon light made everything look the same. Dense forest, rocky slopes, no clean landmarks. They tried to retrace their steps. They failed. That night, she said, they heard sounds. At first, they assumed wildlife. Then the sounds became irregular, almost rhythmic, and seemed to come from more than one direction. When they called out, there was no answer. They slept poorly, waking repeatedly. In the morning, they tried the radio. No signal. They tried the map and compass. The topography didn't line up with their expectations. She described an increasing sense of disorientation, as if the landscape refused to match what it was supposed to be. They walked for hours and felt like they were moving in circles. At some point, she couldn't say exactly when they found the cave. It seemed like shelter, a place to regroup. They intended to stay briefly. Then days blurred. When Dr. Vale asked why they didn't simply choose one direction and keep going, Tessa became visibly distressed. She described overwhelming dread that grew stronger the farther they moved from the cave. She said it felt physical pressure, nausea, a pounding heart. She said the trees and rocks felt like they were watching. When asked whether she believed this now, Tessa hesitated and said she didn't know anymore. She admitted hunger and fear broke down her ability to think clearly. She admitted they ate plants and fungi they weren't sure about. Some made them sick. Some made their dreams vivid and strange. Dr. Vale noted that Tessa showed occasional insight, an awareness that her mind might have been distorted. That, Dr. Vale wrote, was a positive sign for long-term recovery. Miles's interviews were more volatile. He often began answering, then veered into tangents. He spoke in vivid detail about being watched, about figures in the trees that never moved when he stared at them, but shifted when he looked away. He described low hums and clicks, whispers from the ground. When Dr. Rourke asked whether he believed these were real, Miles insisted they were. He said Tessa saw them too. He said the only reason they survived was because they learned to stay quiet. He described rules they developed. Do not leave after dark. Do not make loud noises. Do not eat the red berries. Do not look directly at the shapes. He said, breaking the rules resulted in punishment, illness, terror, and the sensation of being chased even when nothing was visible. Dr. Rourke documented the classic features of a delusional system persecution themes, environmental agents, ritualized rules, while noting the plausible amplifiers: starvation, isolation, hypothermia, stress, and repeated ingestion of psychoactive or toxic plants. Both clinicians agreed on a likely psychological mechanism, a shared break triggered by getting lost, compounded by physical collapse and poisoning, reinforced by mutual dependence until rational decision-making eroded. Detective Ortiz used these evaluations to build a working theory. The couple became disoriented early, left the main trail, took shelter in the cave, and over weeks began foraging, accidentally consuming toxic and hallucinogenic species that worsened cognitive impairment. Fear became self-sustaining. The cave became safe. Leaving became danger. Over time, they stopped acting like people trying to be rescued and began acting like people trying to survive a threat their minds insisted was real. Ortiz also consulted a wilderness survival specialist, Graham Weller, to assess whether nearly 2 years of survival was plausible. Weller confirmed it was brutally difficult, but possible in that region. Seasonal water sources, small game, edible plants, and sheltered terrain can sustain life for extended periods if someone adapts. But he emphasized that such survival comes with enormous physical and psychological cost. The question remained, why had the original search missed them? Ortiz reviewed 2017 search maps and grids. The cave was located outside the couple's registered itinerary and was naturally concealed by dense tree cover and rock formations that blended into the landscape. Helicopter passes hadn't flagged it. Ground teams, without any evidence pointing to that direction, had focused on more probable corridors. Teams might have come within a few miles, but without smoke visible from open air, without deliberate signals, and with the cave mouth obscured, the couple could have been close enough to rescue to hear distant sounds and still remain hidden. And hidden is sometimes all the wilderness needs. In the days after the rescue, the hospital became a strange crossroads. Medicine and law, family and media, relief and dread all pressed into the same fluorescent hallways. Renee Hartman arrived in Jackson the morning after the helicopter landed, driving through the dark and then through dawn, as if the sun might change what was waiting for her. She expected tears, a reunion scene you could frame and hang on a wall. What she found instead was something quieter and harder. 2 people technically alive, but living behind glass. Tessa didn't rush into her sister's arms. She didn't even look up at first. When Renee said her name, Tessa flinched as if the sound itself was sharp. A nurse gently guided Renee back a step and explained that sudden stimulation could trigger panic. Renee stood there with her hands half raised, unsure what to do with love, when love became too loud. Miles was more reactive. He stared at Renee, then at the door, then at the corner of the room, as if measuring escape routes. When Renee said, "You're safe," Miles whispered, "Don't say that here." His voice cracked on the last word. Over the next week, ICU staff kept both patients on a careful medical protocol. They were at high risk of refeeding syndrome, electrolyte imbalance, cardiac strain, infection problems that can kill a starving body even after rescue. Calories came in measured increments, paired with vitamins and constant blood monitoring. Antibiotics treated infected cuts and skin lesions. Wound care teams cleaned feet that had lived barefoot for too long, trimming dead tissue, treating embedded splinters and fissures, dressing swollen joints. Miles's frostbite damage was worse than initially suspected. 2 toes showed necrotic areas that did not respond to warming protocols. A vascular specialist recommended minor surgical intervention to prevent infection from spreading. The procedure was small in technical terms and enormous in emotional ones. After nearly 2 years of surviving, the body still demanded its price. Tessa's dehydration was severe enough that her kidneys showed early signs of stress. Fluids helped, but the recovery was not immediate. She slept in short bursts, waking startled, eyes scanning the room. Nurses learned to approach slowly, announce themselves softly, keep movements predictable. They dimmed lights. They minimized alarms. They tried to make the hospital feel less like a trap. Psychiatric care began even before discharge from intensive medical treatment. Dr. Kendra Vale, the psychologist, focused first on stabilizing the present, orienting them to time, place, and safety. She avoided direct confrontation of delusions early on, because arguing with a damaged survival narrative can make it tighten its grip. Instead, she offered grounding tools, breathing patterns, tactile focus, small questions with answers that could be proven. What day is it? Where are you right now? What can you hear? What can you touch? Miles tolerated these exercises in brief stretches, then slipped back into watchfulness. Tessa participated more quietly, eyes down, fingers fidgeting with the hospital blanket, as if its texture was a rope she could hold on to. Detective Janelle Ortiz waited for medical clearance before attempting formal investigative interviews. There was no criminal suspicion, but there was still a duty to document the timeline, confirm identity beyond doubt, and understand whether the couple posed any risk to themselves or others. Park administrators also wanted answers that could inform future safety messaging. If two experienced hikers could vanish and remain hidden for nearly 2 years, the system needed to understand how. When Ortiz finally met Miles in a quiet consultation room, she didn't start with the wilderness. She started with basic facts, letting him regain a sense of control. Tell me your full name. Tell me your date of birth. Tell me the last thing you remember before the trip. Miles answered those questions slowly, sometimes correctly, sometimes with odd hesitations. When he began describing the hike, his narrative was clear for the first day, then fractured. On the second day, he said, "The map got mean." Ortiz asked what he meant. Miles looked at her with genuine confusion, as if surprised she didn't understand a simple truth. "It stopped matching," he said, like it didn't want to be read. Ortiz tried again, gently, requesting specific actions instead of interpretations. Where did they turn? What did the terrain look like? Did they cross water? Did they climb? Miles offered pieces: a narrow path, deer tracks, a slope that felt steeper than expected, a creek that sounded wrong at night. He mentioned trying the radio. He mentioned hearing something that made him think people were nearby, then realizing there were no voices, only echoes. When Ortiz asked why they didn't keep moving until they found a trail, Miles's hands began to tremble. He pressed his palms against the table as if trying to stop them. "We tried," he said. "It kept folding, like walking through a sheet that snaps back." Ortiz recognized the language of delusion, but she didn't label it in front of him. She noted the recurring themes: circling, pressure, the sensation of being watched. She also noted something else. Miles's story wasn't performative. He wasn't trying to entertain. He was trying to describe something that had happened inside his brain with the vocabulary available to him. Tessa's first interview with Ortiz lasted only 9 minutes. She answered her name and confirmed she recognized Renee. Then she froze, staring at the wall as if listening to something beyond it. Dr. Vale ended the interview, explaining that cognitive stamina was limited and forcing it could worsen dissociation. Weeks passed. By mid-August 2019, both Miles and Tessa had stabilized enough medically to leave the hospital, but neither was ready for independent living. They were transferred to a long-term trauma rehabilitation facility in Idaho 1, with medical monitoring, psychiatric care, and structured reintegration programs. It was a place designed for slow recovery, not quick discharge. The first month, there was a tug-of-war between safety and autonomy. Staff encouraged routine: wake times, meals, supervised walks, therapy sessions. Miles resisted structure at first, interpreting it as control. He tested limits, refusing medication, pacing hallways, insisting lights stay on because dark is when they come. At night, he slept poorly. When he did sleep, he woke in panic, convinced he smelled smoke or heard clicking from the ground. Tessa's trauma presented differently. She wasn't aggressive. She was absent. Some days she spoke only when required. Some days she spoke in surprising bursts, lucid observations about the facility, the food, the weather, then collapsed back into silence as if language cost too much. She had recurring nightmares and woke crying without words to explain why. Dr. Vale, consulting remotely, urged patience. In extreme survival cases, the mind's protective mechanisms can become habitual. Hypervigilance becomes default. Dissociation becomes refuge. Recovery is not a straight line. It is a series of small negotiations with a nervous system that has learned the world is dangerous. The facility's psychiatrist, Dr. Owen Rourke, prescribed medication cautiously enough to reduce acute anxiety and paranoia, not enough to dull cognition. Therapy focused on stabilization first, trauma processing later. In group sessions, Miles listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he often framed fear as logic. "If you don't watch, you die," he told one group. "That's not paranoia, that's math." Tessa's breakthroughs came in quieter forms. Occupational therapy reintroduced basic life tasks that had been erased by years of survival mode. She learned to tolerate enclosed rooms without panicking. She learned to eat without scanning each bite as if it might betray her. She learned to sleep with lights low. Each skill looked simple from the outside. Inside, each one was a small defiance of the cave. In September 2019, investigators returned to the cave site for a deeper forensic sweep. The goal was not to build a criminal case, but to understand survival patterns. Soil samples were taken around the fire pit. Plant remnants were cataloged. The team mapped nearby water sources and noted seasonal availability. They found evidence of repeated use of a narrow path leading from the cave to a small stream boot prints were absent, but compressed vegetation suggested habitual foot traffic. A shallow rock depression downstream contained charcoal residue, hinting at small cooking fires made away from the cave, perhaps to reduce smoke visibility. They also found a scatter of berry stems and mushroom fragments in a shaded area near the cave. A botanist identified multiple species, some edible, some mildly toxic, some potentially hallucinogenic, depending on preparation and dose. Investigators couldn't prove what Miles and Tessa had consumed at any given time, but the environment offered a plausible cocktail of physiological and psychological stressors: dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia exposure, and intermittent poisoning. Ortiz compiled her findings into a final report in November 2019. The conclusion was blunt. There was no evidence of foul play. The disappearance resulted from a navigational error, early equipment failure, and progressive psychological deterioration amplified by survival conditions. The original search missed them because the cave lay outside planned route grids and remained concealed from aerial angles and standard ground corridors. Without deliberate signaling, because they either didn't think to, couldn't, or feared doing so. Searchers had no sensory hook to detect them. The case closed on paper, but not in the bodies and minds of the two people at its center. The media response was immediate and messy. Headlines called it a miracle. Talk shows used words like unbelievable and mysterious. Online forums argued about what experienced should mean. Some commenters praised their resilience. Others, with the confidence of people who have never been cold and starving, asked why they didn't just walk out. Renee became a reluctant gatekeeper, fielding calls from journalists and shutting down rumors. She refused interviews in the early months, protective of her sister's privacy, and furious at the way strangers treated trauma as entertainment. Miles's parents in Flagstaff were quieter, but equally firm. They released one statement thanking rescuers and requesting space. Despite the family's efforts, speculation flourished. Conspiracy theories bloomed around the gaps: the missing gear, the lack of signals, the Watcher's language. Some people insisted something paranormal had happened. Others accused the couple of hiding intentionally. The more sensational the claim, the faster it spread. Clinicians watching the public reaction worried about its effect on recovery. Shame can be as corrosive as fear. Survivors often already blame themselves. Public judgment can lock that blame into place. To counter misinformation, the National Park Service and Teton County officials focused on education. They avoided discussing specific clinical details, but they emphasized known realities. Disorientation can happen quickly off trail. Starvation and dehydration impair decision-making. Some wild plants and fungi can alter perception, and fear can narrow choices until safe becomes stuck. They reminded hikers to stay on marked trails, carry reliable communication devices, and leave detailed plans with someone who will notice if you don't return. Privately, park teams reviewed search procedures. Ortiz's report prompted internal discussions about expanding search grids beyond registered itineraries earlier in an operation, and about integrating newer tools, more aggressively drone sweeps in high-risk drainages, thermal imaging in appropriate conditions, and improved mapping of natural shelters like overhangs and caves. No method guarantees success, but the case forced an uncomfortable recognition. Thorough does not mean complete. In early 2020, Miles underwent neurological imaging after clinicians noticed lingering issues with memory and emotional regulation. The results did not offer a neat explanation, but they did show subtle irregularities, consistent with prolonged stress and malnutrition patterns that can emerge when the brain lives in survival mode for too long. Dr. Rourke emphasized that imaging doesn't define destiny, but it can validate what patients feel, that their anxiety isn't a moral failure, it is a nervous system that has been altered. Tessa's recovery accelerated in small, steady ways through 2020. She gained weight gradually. She began speaking more freely in therapy. She started to identify the watcher's narrative as something that had kept her alive by giving her fear a shape, even if the shape wasn't real. Naming that function helped her loosen its grip. Miles improved, too, but unevenly. Some weeks he seemed grounded, able to discuss the cave without spiraling. Other weeks he backslid, hyper-vigilant, suspicious, convinced something outside the facility was tracking him. His therapist reframed those episodes as nervous system surges rather than failures. Recovery, she told him, was learning what to do when fear returned, not pretending fear would never return. By late 2020, clinicians agreed the couple should not live together, at least not yet. Their bond, forged and hardened by shared survival, also reinforced shared patterns. The facility encouraged structured contact, short supervised conversations, separate therapy plans, boundaries that allowed each to become an individual again. In March 2021, Miles and Tessa met in a therapist-mediated session designed to help them process shared trauma without recreating it. They had not been alone together since the rescue. Both carried the awkwardness of familiarity with someone who had become a mirror. Tessa looked healthier, but her eyes still carried a wariness that didn't match the calm room. Miles sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for impact. When the therapist asked what they wanted from the meeting, both hesitated. "I want to stop feeling like I'm still there," Tessa said finally. Miles swallowed. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I don't know who I am without it." They spoke about the early days, the wrong turn, the sense of the trail vanishing, the cave as shelter. They spoke about fear becoming structure, about rules becoming religion. They spoke about love, how it kept them alive, and how it also trapped them in the same mental loop because leaving together felt impossible, but leaving alone felt worse. Near the end of the session, Tessa said something that made Miles's eyes fill. "I don't blame you," she told him. "I blame the hunger. I blame the sickness. I blame the way fear sounds like truth when you haven't slept." Miles nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, not as a dramatic confession, but as a tired fact. They left the session with a clearer understanding. They had survived together, but recovery would require separation. The marriage, as it had existed before the mountains, could not be rebuilt on the foundation that remained. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was damage. The divorce was finalized quietly in early 2022. After discharge into outpatient care, Tessa moved in with Renee and Jackson temporarily, then returned to Flagstaff in mid-2022, choosing familiar altitude and familiar streets over the valleys that had become symbolic of disappearance. She resumed design work, cautiously smaller contracts, flexible deadlines, work she could step away from when panic rose. She also began volunteering with a local crisis support organization, drawn to people who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from fragments. Miles returned to Flagstaff as well, but he lived with his parents at first. He struggled with crowds, with sudden noises, with any environment where he couldn't see exits. He avoided trails. He avoided forests. Even parks with manicured paths made his chest tighten. His therapist encouraged controlled exposure. Short walks at dawn, quiet neighborhoods, predictable routes. He began journaling, not as a record of the cave, but as a way to create a narrative that belonged to him. Over time, the journaling shifted into creative writing fictional scenes that contained the emotions without the facts. He never published them. He didn't want an audience. He wanted relief. In 2023, Tessa and Renee co-founded a small nonprofit focused on supporting families of missing persons and providing resources for survivors of traumatic wilderness incidents. It started modestly, a website, a phone line that connected families to counseling referrals, a curated list of practical steps for dealing with the first days of a disappearance. Tessa understood the brutal limbo of missing from both sides, the person who vanishes and the people who wait. She didn't posture as an expert. She spoke as someone who had lived the gray space and come back different. The nonprofit partnered with local outdoor groups to offer safety workshops, how to plan routes, how to carry redundant navigation tools, how to communicate emergency plans, how to resist the seductive idea that confidence replaces caution. Tessa also talked openly about the psychological side of survival, how panic narrows attention, how starvation changes thought, how isolation can breed hallucinations and delusions. It wasn't meant to scare people away from wilderness. It was meant to make respect fashionable again. Miles stayed out of the public eye. He declined interview requests, even when documentaries approached. He didn't want his worst moments edited into suspense. When asked privately why he refused, he told his therapist, "I already lived in a story. I don't want to be one." Logan Pierce, the hiker who smelled smoke and made the call, also avoided publicity for a long time. He gave a single statement for the official record, then disappeared back into his own quiet life. But in 2025, after years of being contacted by strangers who wanted details, he wrote a short essay published in a regional outdoor magazine. It wasn't sensational. It was reflective, focused on the ethics of encounter. He wrote about that moment at the cave entrance, how easy it would have been to assume the smoke was nothing, how tempting it was to walk away from something unsettling. He wrote about the responsibility of being the person who stumbles into someone else's hidden suffering. And he wrote about the strange grief that followed, even after the rescue succeeded, the knowledge that two people had been alive, so close to search corridors, while the world assumed they were gone. By the end of 2025, Miles and Tessa lived separate lives, each stitched together with routines and therapy, and the kind of resilience that isn't glamorous. They both carried ongoing symptoms, nightmares, flashbacks, spikes of panic, moments where certain smells or shadows yanked them backward. Healing didn't erase the past. It taught them how to live beside it. Tessa kept working, kept advocating, kept building something useful out of what had almost destroyed her. She never returned to Grand Teton. She didn't need to prove anything to the mountains. Miles slowly expanded his world. By late 20 to 25, he could walk certain desert trails outside Flagstaff open terrain, where sightlines were long and trees didn't create the same claustrophobic geometry of fear. He still avoided dense forests. He still hated caves and movies. But he had begun to recognize a crucial truth. The Watchers weren't waiting in the rocks anymore. They were echoes in his nervous system, and echoes can fade. The cave itself remained unmarked to the public. Rangers logged its coordinates internally and checked it periodically during patrols, not because they expected to find another lost couple living there, but because the wilderness has a way of repeating patterns when people forget the lessons. In the end, the case did not defy explanation. It defied comfort. It showed how quickly an ordinary trip can become a crisis, how a small navigational mistake can cascade, how equipment failure can seal a fate, and how the mind, when starved and frightened and isolated, can become both a survival tool and a trap. Miles and Tessa did not survive because they were invincible. They survived because they adapted, even as adaptation eroded them. They survived because they kept breathing through days that stopped feeling like days. They survived because a stranger followed the smell of smoke instead of ignoring it. And for everyone who reads their story as an oddity, a once-in-a-generation mystery, the hardest truth is also the simplest. Sometimes in wild places, disappearance isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's only a mile away from where everyone is looking.